Welcome to Mission Imperfect, the podcast about navigating the twists and turns of life and embracing the imperfections of the journey.
We're your hosts, life coaches Catherine and Kirsty, and our mission is to support you in finding your own path, your own way, with greater clarity and self trust, no matter how messy or uncertain things may seem.
We address the roadblocks that come up time and time again for our coaching clients, from acceptance and boundaries to values and well-being and everything in between.
As well as asking lots of questions, a coach's favourite thing to do, we'll be sharing thoughts and insights and offering plenty of tips, tools, and techniques for you to try.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to grab a cuppa and a biscuit and join us in getting lost in finding ourselves. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mission Imperfect. Now, this is one that I think is going to land quite hard for a lot of us, and it's all about the comfort and the cost of trying to stay in control.
Yeah, we just thought, like many of the topics we talk about, there are certain words that can sort of bring about a bit of a reaction, aren't there? People there have like quite a strong, perhaps positive connotation or a negative one. And I think control is definitely
Mhm.
one of those. It can sound quite bossy, rigid, even a bit coercive. And if you think
Yeah.
about some of the terms we associate with that word, we say things like control freak, don't we? And we don't mean that in a good way. And yet we also talk about things like being out of control, which is also not good. So no wonder
It's,
it's a bit of a minefield.
it's a bit of a lose-lose situation, is it? I mean, nobody wants to be
Yes.
thought of as controlling,
Yes.
but nobody really wants to be thought of as losing control.
Yes,
So,
exactly. So you need to find the
yeah.
perfect amount of control in the middle and maintain it, which we're going to discuss being rather tricky, but we're going to try and take a more balanced view of control and still touch on why we can really wrestle with it because control is often a desire for safety, and that's
Mm.
something that humans like. And it's a way to try and manage uncertainty. And we don't like that. So you can see why it sort of strikes this balance in there. That's what we think it's going to do.
Yeah.
And, in the current climate, when things feel very uncertain, there's lots we can't predict, there's lots we can't rely on. And so we have a desire to control, and it can ramp up in response to all that uncertainty, if that makes sense.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, as you say, when there's so much going on that just seems crazy, and you feel you've got no kind of, I mean, let's use the word influence even. Not necessarily control. You've got no kind of influence on what's going on. But so you can't control that, but you can control, for instance, how tidy your house is. It might be that, I mean, perhaps an old favourite that can work for and against you. I can't control how people treat me, but I can control how I respond. Which I think can be a bit of a two-edged sword. But I can't control the cost of living crisis, but I can control how many biscuits I eat. Well, some people might be able to. Obviously, I can't. That's totally out of control on that one.
Do you know what? I'm impressed. On an episode about control, we got in biscuits because, yes, the self
Yeah,
control and biscuits has a nice affinity for us, doesn't it? Because,
or not.
yeah,
Yes, not happening.
back slightly on the subject
Oh,
of control.
sorry. Yes.
This isn't about blaming ourselves for wanting it because it is quite a normal human
Yeah.
response. But we can try to understand it when and why it shows up and why we can get stuck grappling for it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the signs that we might want control. I mean, obviously there are some obvious ones. For example, we want to choose where we go for dinner, for example, because we know the menu and we like it, as opposed to a random surprise. But there are more subtle signs as well. So it could be things like we overthink decisions because we want to
Mhm.
control the outcome. We replay conversations because we wanted a different response or a different reaction, maybe from ourselves or from someone else. I think
Oh,
this is one
I,
that
I
everyone can
am.
relate to.
Yeah, I am clearly a massive control freak. Then, possibly the massivest ever control freak, based on that. Okay,
No, I
carry on.
think I think you're not
Carry on.
alone. I really do. So I think that was one people can definitely relate to. I do
Yeah.
it too. Replay conversations. Normally where I think of something really witty to say as opposed to, something really useless. But you know,
Yes. And it's such a
um,
waste that you never get to say it, isn't it? But
I
anyway.
know. Yeah, saying it like, half an hour later doesn't quite work, does it? Anyway, we can feel responsible for other people's reactions because we assume it was within our control for it to be different.
Mm.
We can try and plan every outcome, and this is to do with that desire for certainty that we spoke about. And we can feel tense when things are open ended because we want that certainty.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah, and maybe there's something here too as well about repressing or perhaps curating our emotions when it comes to that
mm,
self-control. We don't want to lose control. We want the right kind of control of ourselves and how we respond to everything.
yeah,
So not
it,
letting
it
the anger or the stress show.
mm, and that can be dangerous place to be as well, isn't it? When you supply,
Yeah.
because they have a tendency to kind of bubble
Hmm.
if you don't have a sort of release for these things. So it's no wonder it's quite a tricky thing to navigate when you put it in that kind of context. When we read through that list, I think we had about six things there. I imagine most people can relate to at least a few of those things and think, oh, okay, so that's perhaps a little bit of control wrestling at play. So,
Yeah.
but is there actually a downside to being in control? Because all that
Mm.
said, you can think, well, actually, perhaps being in control is a good thing. But this is the problem. We can't always have it. And accepting our lack of control is sometimes hard.
Mhm.
It starts often as a measure of self protection, or at least an attempt at it, but it can be draining and even fruitless because it's a human trait to think we can control or at least influence more than we actually can. But that can be very depleting of our energy. It can reduce our trust in ourselves and others, limit our options, and keep us in a sort of managing state rather than a living and experiencing state. And I don't say that
Mm.
lightly, and I'm making that sound like it's an easy thing to do. But when you're trying to control every detail of your life, you think about your day, you can't control every aspect of it, can you? Certainly, you can't control the weather, you can't control whether other people are going to be on time, you can't control everything that's going to happen
We can't
at
control when the
work.
bus turns up. Yes.
Yes, I think you might be speaking from experience
Not
there, Kirsty.
not
So
that I'm bitter. No.
the thing is, control, even though we might think it doesn't automatically mean to outcomes. And maybe it's the feeling of control that gives us comfort and reassurance in an
Mm.
expected outcome. Maybe there's something to do with that, because sometimes we do have unexpected good things happen as well, don't we? And the thing
Yeah, I
is,
mean, but quite a lot of people will tell you they don't like surprises. We usually associate a surprise with something good. And most of us
mm,
will say we don't like shocks, and that's really quite reasonable and probably
yes,
true for 99.9% of us. But you also hear people say they don't like surprises. It's even if something good is happening, if it's not something that they were expecting and feel in control of, it can be disconcerting rather than enjoyable.
so true, isn't it? You just
Yeah.
reminded me of the amount of self-control I did try to demonstrate the other day
Oh,
when I'd say, an unpleasant surprise of an enormous spider in my bedroom
oh no.
again. It's just, I know, it's like, well, why is it always in the bedroom? I mean, I'd rather it was
Spike.
outside because then at least I can run away. That's the point. But when it's in my bedroom, in the corner above the bed, and it took all my willpower, I think, not to shriek my head off because I think I've mentioned spiders before.
You
I'm
have,
no good at
yes.
them. Clearly, I've not managed to do anything to overcome
Oh,
that fear. But yes, I definitely don't feel any sense of control when I see one because I just think, I don't know why. Why am I threatened by something that's so much smaller than I am? But there you go. It's an irrational
you
one. But
you may not have felt control, but you did demonstrate some control because you didn't,
yeah,
well,
this
you
is
said you
true.
didn't shriek your head off.
Yes, this is true. I think
There
I
you go.
muttered a few expletives and exited the room.
That's not a bad thing. A few expletives help massively in almost any situation. They're allowed.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, so my spider story has got us a little bit off on a tangent, as we normally do. Biscuits and spiders seem to be the order of the day today. But yes, so trying to exert control when it is actually limited, it can reduce flexibility, can reduce possibility, and can even mask other things going on, like grief, or in my case, in
Mm.
that example, very much fear. And it can even distance us from others, even with good intentions.
Yeah, but I guess if you're exerting control in order not to show what you really think and feel, perhaps, or to manipulate the outcomes of situations, that doesn't create a genuine connection, does it?
Mm.
So that,
Yeah.
yeah, it creates that distance. Hmm,
I
interesting.
think, yeah, I think, you know what? I think the thing that's really coming up about control, with it being that word, because it's not a word I particularly like. I do associate it with those negative things like
Hmm,
control freak and being controlled. No one wants to be controlled, do they? They don't want to feel like
no,
they're under someone else's control. We want
true.
independence
Yeah.
to have our own thought. I think it comes down to this thing about trying to feel more certain. That's what I think it is often about, because we want to think we know what's going to happen. We know what someone else is going to say. We know what the response is going to be. We know that the bus is going to come on time. We know that the interview is going to go well.
Totally.
We want all of those things to happen. And we just have to accept that we don't have that. And I think that's really at the root of this kind of
Hmm.
grappling for control. And it gets really complicated, of course, when it involves other people, doesn't it? Because really, that's not within our scope of control.
No, and that's where you risk becoming controlling, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
So
most
even
most
when you
people
have
who are described
perhaps,
as controlling, it's usually more to do with other people and how they are around other people than
yeah,
it is to do with situations, isn't it? And
it's
things.
really hard to avoid it altogether if you think about it. So certainly as a parent, for example, you know, I to a degree, you could say I control the amount of TV my daughter watches because I'm sure she would love to just watch it non-stop, including when she goes to be going to bed and, you know, when we're eating and things like that. So I suppose you do exert some control as a parent, but it's at what point you decide to sort of draw the line and let them make their own choices and have that independence versus what you think is probably better for them. And you probably are right. This is what I mean about the good intentions part.
Yeah.
And it is hard, isn't it? Because with certain things as a parent, you definitely do want to draw boundaries on and be quite firm about.
Maybe control is the wrong word in those situations. But if you allow it to be different in one situation, it becomes tricky to not excuse it in others, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, lots of
Yeah.
grey areas coming up.
I know. And I think I'm not sure we're really unpicking this one. Maybe this is the
We're
first
making
episode
it
ever where
worse.
we're yes, we're so we've
But
chosen a topic. We thought we had some ideas, but we've actually decided it's even worse than we thought, and we don't have any
I,
tips for you.
I tell you what, Catherine, we are out of control.
Yes,
When
there
it
we go. We're
comes to
out of control of
control,
this
we
episode.
are out of control. But actually, you know what? Maybe there is something a little bit liberating, certain opportunity with allowing things to be out of control, maybe even allowing perhaps yourself to be out of control sometimes in some ways, because the harder we try and maintain that grip on control or any pretense at control, the more it stops us recognizing that actually maybe we can deal with whatever happens.
Yeah,
I mean, we have so
yeah,
far, you know, your track record so far in life is 100% for dealing with whatever has happened.
yeah,
So, what if you trust yourself to do that? What if you don't need the certainty? You can
yeah.
let go of control a little.
That's so true. Because of course, everything in your life to date you've not had total control over, even if we haven't really thought about it that way or um, deliberated it very much. So but it's one of those things when it comes to your attention, you start to think, what is my relationship like with control? Am I near that
Mm.
control freak end of the spectrum? Or am I more, I don't even know if they are opposite end of the spectrum, if I'm honest, the out of control. Anyway, they were just two terms that really came to mind thinking about
Yeah,
the word control and how we can view it so negatively. I don't think there are many really, really positive associations with control. And, being controlled in certain circumstances, yes, I suppose so. Sometimes controlling the emotions or taking control in a difficult situation, that could be a good
that's true.
example.
Yeah.
Um,
I think self-control is often seen as positive, not necessarily always rightly so.
mm,
And as you say, that being able to take control in a stressful situation is seen as a positive.
yeah, I think we're talking a little bit really about people that might be feeling a bit anxious because they're trying to control too much in their lives and we
Yeah.
can't. So if we talk a little bit about reducing our grip on control, I think the place
Hmm.
to start is most likely to understand that we can't control everything. It's in fact far from it. And actually, nor should we. I mean, look what happens with the people who want to have absolute control over everything. It's not a good look, is it? Let's be
It
honest.
rarely ends well. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I mean, it might sound like we're stating the bleeding obvious to quote Fawlty Towers there, but it's it's that conscious awareness thing that we talk about a lot. Yes, as soon as somebody says, yes, but we can't control everything. Well, yeah, obviously. But very often we lose sight of that. We're so
yeah,
busy trying to manage everything to help it turn out how we want it to or how we think it should that we forget that we can't do it for everything.
exactly. And actually, maybe that can be a relief rather than a frustration. I think that's another
Yeah.
way of looking at it because it's not all down to you. You know, it's not everything within your control.
Hmm.
Really good example, for example, is when you apply for a job. um, you see the advert, you decide that you're going to try. That's within your control, your ability to put forward the best application that you possibly can. But you have no control over who else is going to apply. You don't control the criteria that they're going to use to shortlist. You don't control when the interview is going to be, where it's going to be. There's so much of that that's out of your control. There was actually only a small part in your control, which was to decide to apply in the first place. And then you have to let go of control and see what's going to happen. Easier said
Yep,
than done.
absolutely. But yeah, there's only so much we can control, and reminding ourselves of that can be incredibly useful.
Yeah, definitely. So there is actually quite a helpful way of understanding what's actually within our control and helpfully what isn't. We're going to go through that in next week's bite size tools, tips, and techniques episode on this subject. It's called the spheres of control, but we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. I think it's just another helpful visual example to really help put a bit of perspective over what's within your control. So that example of the job interview is a good one where you think, actually, in that whole process, the part that was in my control was actually quite small. It's not as large as people sometimes think that it is. But we'll end this week, as we always do, with a question. Perhaps, is there something you are trying to control in your life in order to feel safe that perhaps you can't? And then totally in brackets, because there might be a small amount of control you can have or a bit of influence, but maybe not totally. So that's something just for people to have a little think about
Oh,
from
yeah.
everything we've discussed about control in this episode.
I think that's an interesting question to keep asking yourself when you are. It's often when you're feeling most out of control that you are most trying to be in control, isn't it?
Mm,
So there's
yes.
times that you are struggling most to feel because you don't feel in control. Asking yourself that question, is there something you were trying to control in order to feel safe that perhaps you can't? It could be quite enlightening.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like
Ooh,
hitting that pause button just for a moment, thinking, is this really my control? You know, is this my responsibility and my control to have here, or is it not? And actually, quite often, I think people might realize it's not.
yeah,
And hopefully, that might be a little bit of a relief rather than frustration. Sometimes it might be a bit of
definitely.
both, if we're honest.
Probably, but if there's a chance of a bit of relief, that's a great thing.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. So, on that note, we will see you again very soon for that bite sized episode where we'll take you through the spheres of control. But until then, we will see you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Mission Imperfect. We'd love to hear your thoughts on any of our episodes, especially if you've had a light bulb moment in answering one of the questions, have benefited from one of the tips, or have a suggestion for an episode topic.
And if these conversations have made you curious about how coaching could help you, Please don't hesitate to get in touch with one or both of us to find out more about what we offer. Until next time, keep being imperfectly you. No one does it better.